Hello, hello, good morning, everybody. You know him, you love him. It's Wilson's World Homeschool with the bow tie professional historian. It's Zach. Hello, Zach.
Hey, how you doing, Wilson?
Doing okay. Usually we do This Week in History, which we'll get back to that next week. But it's time for a little truth bomb right here. I'm going to drop something on you here, Zach. Those who fail to learn from history are condemned to repeat it. George Santayana said that in 1905. Winston Churchill said it as well. As a historian, what does that quote mean to you?
Hey, that's a great question, Wilson. We as a people need to have a good understanding of our past, where we've been, so we can have a better idea of where we're going. The future is unpredictable, and knowing where we've been gives us a good idea of how to navigate the unpredictable future. We need to learn from the mistakes that we've made in the past so we can not make those mistakes again in the future.
And speaking of that, this isn't the first time that people in the Carolinas, people in the Charlotte area, have had to stay home due to a quarantine, due to a pandemic situation.
Absolutely right. I mean, pandemics aren't new to the United States at all. I mean, when our nation was fighting for its independence, before we were a nation, when we were fighting for independence against England, we were doing that in the midst of a smallpox epidemic. And it ran rampant through the camps of George Washington's Continental soldiers. Diseases like this, like the flu, like smallpox, like COVID-19, it spreads from person to person very, very easily, especially when people are really close together. So, for example, in 1776, the smallpox would spread very quickly in the big port cities like Charleston and Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. But then as it went farther west into the less populated parts of the different colonies, it tended to die out. Mm. We see the same thing with the flu in 1918, the so-called Spanish flu. In the spring of 1918, a brand new strain of influenza hit military camps, both in Europe and the United States, one in Kansas. So it spreads through these military camps because these soldiers are so close to one another. In Charlotte, Camp Green, that was in, I think we talked about that on one of our very first This Week in History segments. That camp was devastated by the flu. Young men who probably expected to die in a trench in Europe were killed on American soil by an invisible enemy. They never got to see active combat.
And we were talking, and on the broadcast, I had a conversation with Rhiannon over at Queen City Nerve. She's got an article that came out mentioning some of that from Camp Green and how, Charlotteans, people in the Carolinas, 1918, had to stay home, and there was pressure then to reopen, similar to now. They did open the schools in Charlotte a little bit too soon, and it extended. People were dying from that flu in Charlotte into 1920. And a lot of people kind of contribute that to, well, they reopened too soon. At the same time, even back then, information was, well, I'll let you kind of handle that one, but information was handled interestingly. I'll put it that way.
Sure. So to be fair to the people of the past, they didn't know at first that there was a pandemic going on because it was in the midst of World War I, right, the Great War, and a lot of the countries that were struggling with the flu pandemic in 1918, they were in the midst of this war, and they didn't want to publicize that this flu was going on. It might give their enemies an unfair advantage against them, right? So, but Spain, who was neutral during World War I, was not afraid to report on the facts. That's why we call it the Spanish flu. It was a misconception that the flu started in Spain, when reality, the Spanish were just truthfully telling the news. So for a long time, even in the United States, it was denied that there was a pandemic. It spread across the United States in 1918, and it was kind of dismissed as being just an ordinary strain of the flu. President Woodrow Wilson issued no official statement, and his Surgeon General of the United States, a guy named Robert Blue, said that there was, quote, no cause for alarm if proper precautions are observed, end quote. So it was being denied or played off as something that wasn't very dangerous. But in reality, it was different. It was a brand new strain. It was nothing like we had ever experienced before.
And that kind of goes back to where we started. If you don't look back on history, you may be doomed to repeat it.
Absolutely.
There you go. Zach, I appreciate that. And this is information that is readily available. If anyone would like to look for themselves, feel free. Zach's a historian and he's been studying history pretty much all of his adult life. And this is what he does for a living. But if you feel like you need to find out on your own, go for it. And hey, I'm wearing my patriotic shirt for you. This land was made for you and me. So feel free to research on your own right there. I will wrap up with a little George Bernard Shaw this morning. Beware of false knowledge. It is more dangerous than ignorance. Zach, I appreciate it, my friend. Straighten the bow tie, man. Straighten the bow tie. There you go. Hey, and we're going to get back to This Week in History next week. But Zach, thank you. It was time for a little truth bomb right there, and I appreciate that. Let's not repeat history, everybody. Hey, that's Wilson's World Homeschool. We got more Wilson's World coming up in a bit.